Last week I was dealing with the situation in Acts chapter 21 with Paul in Jerusalem and the controversy and the beginning of laying down basically orders for the Jewish converts and for the Gentile converts. And Paul, as we ended in verse 26, so we're going to start in verse 27, but ending in verse 26, Paul did what the elders requested and took these 4 Jewish converts and went with them to participate in their obeying Mosaic law. That was the criticism. So in verse 27, and by the way, what it's showing very clearly is that the early church is moving away from the simplicity of the gospel. Simplicity of the gospel is relationship with Jesus, which is what the 12 disciples had and the early church had. But you have to have some order and discipline. But it's simple. It's not complicated as now by religions that put so many rules and regulations down. No, it's simple, it's clear, it's uncomplicated. But let's look at verse 27. So, when these 7 days of the purification were over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. So these are not part of the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem. These are Jews from Asia. And they stirred the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Men of Israel, help us. This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against our people and our law and this place." So the accusation is that Paul is teaching people against the Jewish faith, and he's teaching people against Jewish law and even the temple itself. That's not true. It's not true. But how do they come to this conclusion? Well, it's in the same verse. Because he's brought Greeks into the temple area and defiled this holy place. Now, this is wrong, as so many things are, because it says quite clearly in verse 20, they'd previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul. Trophimus was one of the believers from Ephesus, and they'd seen him in the city, in Jerusalem, with Paul. And they assumed, because Paul has been identified with these 4 Jewish converts that I referred to last time in the temple, they're assuming that Trophimus, who is, as far as we can see, Gentile, and because he's in Jerusalem with Paul, they're assuming that Paul defiled the temple by bringing a Gentile in. Oh dear, oh dear. You know, we still have these problems today. Verse 30. This upset the whole of Jerusalem. And it puts it very bluntly, and knowing demonstrations today, you can understand the language. The whole city was aroused and the people came running from all directions. They seized Paul. They dragged him out of the temple. The problem was they're accusing him of doing something defiling the temple. So they dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. But actually in verse 31, they were trying to kill him. Oh, goodness me. You know, sadly, with our demonstrations today over issues that are not connected with religion, they get so violent that they do kill people. So, this news, according to verse 31, reached the commander of the Roman army. the Roman troops. Remember that Jerusalem is under the control of the Romans. The Romans had defeated the Greeks, taken control, and this applied even in the time when Jesus was born, that the Romans were in control. I mean, this was captured territory. This was part of the Roman Empire. So the news reached the commander of the Roman soldiers that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. Well, he had to take some action, and verse 32 says, he at once took some officers and soldiers, ran down to the crowd. And when the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. You can understand now why the prophets were warning Paul against going to Jerusalem, but he's gone, and now it's happening. So in verse 33, the commander came up, arrested Paul, ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then, and only when he'd done that, he turned to Paul and he asked who he was and what he had done. But before Paul could answer, in verse 34, some in the crowd shouted one thing and some in another, and there was so much confusion with the accusations against Paul that the commander couldn't get to the truth because of the uproar. So he ordered that Paul would be taken not just into a prison, but into the military barracks. Right. By verse 35, when Paul reached the steps to go into the army headquarters, when Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great. I mean, can you imagine what's happening? This is a massive uproar in Jerusalem, and the violence is still continuing despite the military being there. But it was so strong that it says in verse 35 that the soldiers had to actually take him. He's already in chains. They had to take him and carry him into the barracks. And in verse 36, the crowd that followed him kept shouting, well, basically, lock him up, take him away, lock him up. They wanted him put in prison. So you can see the violent situation that's happening, and it's so significant, but this is happening in Jerusalem, which is where Jesus lived part of his time, where he died. Jerusalem, where all the incidents leading up to the day of Pentecost happened. Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem, buried in Jerusalem. The day of Pentecost, the first church was formed in Jerusalem, and we're already dealing with a controversy amongst these early believers. As I mentioned in the previous chapter, what laws the Gentiles converts would keep as opposed to Jewish converts. Now you've got the non-believing, these are Orthodox Jews. I mean, Jerusalem, it was Jewish. The people were Jews. These are Orthodox Mosaic Jews, keeping the laws of Moses, and they're angry with Paul.